Hello, and welcome to Sad History for Sleep. Wherever you are joining from, whether it's late at night in a quiet room or a soft dawn breaking over your window, I invite you to settle in. Maybe you're curled under a blanket or listening while your mind floats between thoughts. Wherever you are and whatever time it is, I'm grateful you're here. Before we begin tonight's journey into the past, I gently ask, if you feel inclined, leave a comment below sharing where you're listening from and what time you press play. It helps others find their way here, and it helps us create a quiet community across time zones and places. If you enjoy these stories and want more of them, a like and a subscription would mean a lot. Now, let's begin. Tonight we're drifting back to a time not too far from now, and to a place where the silence of rural fields held the echoes of a utopia gone horribly wrong, Cambodia. The late 1970s, a time when the lush beauty of Southeast Asia, the rustling palms, the distant hum of insects, the scent of damp earth after monsoon rain, became the backdrop to one of the quietest, deadliest revolutions of the 20th century. You may have heard the name Pol Pot. You may know the broad strokes, the genocide, the killing fields, the suffering. But tonight, we won't focus on headlines. Instead, I want to guide you gently through what it was like, just to live there. To be an ordinary person, a rice farmer, a mother, a child, a teacher, a baker, a student, someone who wanted to read a book or wear a watch, or maybe just sleep a little longer before sunrise. What was it like to survive in a world where the rules changed overnight, and where having a pair of glasses could cost you your life? We'll begin at the beginning, at the idea, before the terror. Let your breath slow, and imagine yourself in Cambodia, in April 1975. The revolution has just won. The Khmer Rouge is celebrating victory, and year zero has begun. Imagine this, a soft, humid morning, still thick with the haze of early sun. The streets of Phnom Penh are eerily calm. Soldiers, many of them boys no older than 16, stand guard at intersections. Their black uniforms are crisp and simple, their expressions unreadable. Loudspeakers crackle to life. The message is clear. The war is over. The Americans are gone. Peace is here. But the peace feels strange. It feels too sudden, too absolute. You see, the Khmer Rouge, under the leadership of a man named Saloth Sar, better known as Pol Pot, have taken power, and they have a vision, a radical, pure, revolutionary dream. They call it Year Zero. To Pol Pot, everything that came before, books, money, schools, cities, traditions, names, was corrupt. Polluted by imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, even religion, even family. In his mind, Cambodia could only be saved if it was wiped clean, like a chalkboard before a new lesson. Imagine a world where all the clocks reset to zero. Imagine a society where owning a spoon could be suspect, where writing a diary was dangerous. This was not just political ideology. It was an experiment on real lives, done not with chemicals in a lab, but with human beings in rice paddies. The Khmer Rouge wanted to build a perfect society, one with no rich or poor, no currency, no cities, no intellectuals, only workers, only farms, only Angkar, the organisation, the faceless entity that would rule every thought, every bowl of rice, every breath. For many, this idea of equality sounded fair, even noble, especially to peasants who had known only hardship and exploitation. But the reality was something else entirely. Instead of rising up, people were pulled down. The rich were emptied, the educated were erased, the cities were drained, families were split, schools were shut. Imagine you were a teacher. One day you're reading poetry to your class. The next you're told to leave everything behind and walk into the countryside. No questions, no explanations. And if you resist, even quietly, you vanish. Just vanish. This was the beginning of Year Zero. There was a strange mechanical clarity to it. All property was seized. Books were burned. Private conversation became suspicious. Language shifted. You no longer said I, you said we. You didn't say mother, you said comrade. People stopped wearing jewellery, watches, makeup. Even love songs disappeared. A society began to flatten, like wet clay pressed down by a cold, ruthless hand. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about transformation. It was about making people forget who they had been. Even names were changed, and not just for security, but for erasure. You were no longer Vanak or Sofip. You became a number, or just you, or sometimes nothing. And still, the fields awaited. That was the centre of this new dream, the rice field. To the Khmer Rouge, the peasant was the perfect human, honest, self-sufficient, untainted by modern corruption. So everyone, whether factory owner or violinist, was sent to labour. Imagine the strain of hands unused to work, raw and blistered within days. The sun was not just hot, it was oppressive, a silent overseer. And at the end of the day there was no reward, just a thin broth of rice water, a cot made of reeds, and orders for tomorrow. This was Pol Pot's utopia, a place where individuality was dangerous, where speaking too much or too softly could raise suspicion, where the past was a threat, and where dreaming of a different future could be fatal. As we leave this segment, imagine yourself standing in one of those endless rice fields, the water up to your ankles, the distant rhythm of tools in the mud, the sun dipping low, but there's still more work to do, always more work. In the distance, a loudspeaker hums, its voice is flat, official, and your stomach growls. Again, this is just the beginning. Let's now step into what happened when the cities were emptied, when all of Phnom Penh was told to leave. Imagine yourself in a city waking from war. It's April 17th, 1975. The capital city of Cambodia, Phnom Penh, is stirring in the warm morning air. The war, it seems, is finally over. There are rumours of peace. A fragile hope clings to the cracked sidewalks and soot-covered rooftops. For years, the city had been a place of refuge. Hundreds of thousands fled here during the Civil War, seeking safety from the bombings and crossfire in the countryside. Hospitals overflowed. Schools had become makeshift clinics. Families huddled together in cramped apartments and shacks. Now, the fighting has stopped. People step outside their doors for the first time in days, and then they see them. Khmer Rouge soldiers, marching through the streets. They wear simple black uniforms, sandals made from car tyres, red and white checkered scarves. Many are teenagers. Their faces are stoic, their eyes unreadable. Then the orders come. Everyone must leave the city. Everyone. No exceptions, no explanations, no time. Imagine you are standing at your doorstep, hearing the news echo from every street corner. The voice on the loudspeaker says the Americans are about to bomb the city. It says it's only temporary. 3 days maybe. So you grab what you can, a blanket, a bag of rice, a child's hand, maybe a photograph or two, tucked quietly into a shirt pocket as if memory itself has become contraband. And then you walk. You and everyone else. An entire city, 2 million people on foot. A human river pouring out of Phnom Penh, stretching for miles. Old women hobbling with canes, children clinging to their mothers, men pushing loved ones in wheelbarrows. The sick carried on makeshift stretchers. Hospital patients still in their beds, wheeled through the streets. 4 bags swinging in the air. Wounded soldiers, barely conscious, being propped up by friends. The air is heavy. The sun is unrelenting. The smell of sweat, dust, diesel fuel and desperation blends together into something you can almost taste. And still, the soldiers shout, "Move! Keep moving! Leave everything behind!" It doesn't take long before people begin to collapse. The elderly, the weak, children who haven't eaten in days, but there's no stopping, no turning back. If you rest too long, a rifle butt might strike your shoulder. If you speak out, you disappear behind a tree. Sometimes you don't return. Some families carry small notes tucked under their clothes, hoping, perhaps foolishly, to return one day, to find their homes, their radios, their books. But they will not. The city will become a ghost. Once emptied, Phnom Penh is stripped bare. Homes are ransacked, hospitals abandoned, dogs wander through silent streets, books rot in the rain. Even the libraries are emptied. The past, it seems, is being scrubbed clean. The journey on foot lasts days, for some weeks. Many die along the way, not with drama, not with cries, but quietly, slipping into the roadside grass. A child who stops breathing, a grandmother who sits down and simply cannot stand again. Their loved ones cannot stop. The line of people must keep moving. The Khmer Rouge direct families into the countryside, into unfamiliar provinces, assigned to unfamiliar villages. People are separated, husbands from wives, parents from children, friends never see each other again. There is no time to say goodbye. Imagine the sound of silence in the crowd, not the silence of peace, but the kind of silence where no one dares speak, because the walls, the trees, the very air might be listening. What had been a city is now an exodus, and what had been a government is now Angkar, the organisation, the faceless voice that knows all, sees all, judges all. In this moment it becomes clear, this is not just about war. This is about control, about unmaking a country and remaking it from the soil up. People arrive in rural areas, exhausted and dazed. Strangers now, even to themselves. They are told they must work. They must contribute. They must not think. They must not remember the city, or their careers, or their schooling. They must begin again. They must become peasants. Rice will be your life now. Fields, your horizon. Your body is no longer yours, and time belongs to Angkar. From city lights to jungle paths, the people of Phnom Penh vanished into Cambodia's countryside, and with them, a way of life disappeared. As we move gently into the next chapter of our story, hold this image in your mind. A silent road, a child being carried asleep on someone's back, and behind them, the skyline of Phnom Penh shrinking into the distance, quiet, hollow. Next, we'll walk with those who survived, into the collective farms, into the endless labour of survival, into rice fields that seem to stretch forever. Now, imagine waking before dawn. The sky is still dark, the air is thick, humid, and still. Somewhere nearby a rooster calls out, but even the animals seem subdued. You rise from a mat of woven reeds, your body stiff from the cold night and the hard ground. You haven't slept well, you rarely do anymore. Your clothes are the same every day, black cotton shirt and trousers, coarse against the skin. Your feet are bare, or wrapped in rubber sandals made from old tyres if you're lucky. And today, like every day, you will work in the fields. This is the rhythm now, the rhythm of the collective farm. Under Pol Pot's vision, private property has been abolished. Everything belongs to Angkar, the homes, the tools, even your time, and your thoughts. Families no longer eat together. Children are sent to youth brigades. Elderly are assigned to special groups. Men and women live in separate longhouses. Even married couples rarely speak. All of this is designed to erase the past, to sever bonds, to make the individual disappear into the mass. The day begins with a call, usually a wooden gong or the shout of a comrade. Everyone assembles in silence, standing in neat lines as a young cadre reads off the day's tasks. Rice planting, canal digging, dike building, forest clearing, always something, always urgent. You're assigned to a work group, 10 or 20 people. You do not get to choose who. You're watched carefully. Your pace, your expression, your energy, your silence. Too slow, you might be punished. Too cheerful, suspicious, too quiet. Also suspicious. The fields are vast and flooded. During planting season you wade knee-deep into the water, your hands sinking into the mud. Your fingers ache. The sun rises slowly, then hangs overhead like a judgmental eye. There is no shade. You plant one rice shoot at a time. Over and over. Step, bend, plant. Step, bend, plant. The mud is warm. Your legs are covered with leeches. You do not swat them. That would slow you down. Hours pass. At midday you're allowed to stop. Lunch is given. A thin, watery porridge. Just a few grains of rice floating in water. Maybe a spoonful of salt if available. Protein is rare. Meat, almost unheard of. Some chew on wild leaves or insects found in the fields. Hunger becomes your constant companion. Your body begins to shrink. Your cheeks hollow. Your skin darkens from the sun, then cracks from the dryness. Your hands blister, then callous, then split again. And yet, you continue. In the evening you return not to rest, but to another meeting. A self-criticism session. Each person must confess mistakes, admit shortcomings, accuse themselves before anyone else can. If you say too little, they suspect defiance. If you say too much, they remember it. Someone may be denounced. Perhaps a man was caught with extra rice, or a woman spoke too fondly of the old days. They are taken away. You do not ask where. The group disperses, quietly, carefully. At night, You sleep where you're told. Thin mats, open huts, no privacy, no whispers. The night air hums with insects. Occasionally the distant sound of footsteps, a shout, then silence again. You dream of food, of family, of your old bed. But even your dreams are fading. This is life on the collective farm, not dramatic, not loud, just endless, repetitive, dehumanizing, a slow erosion of the self. But even in this life, there is memory. People find ways to hold on. A woman recites recipes in her mind, even though she hasn't cooked in years. A father hums a lullaby under his breath, careful not to be heard. A child draws shapes in the dirt before someone kicks them away. Imagine standing in that field again. The skies are pale pink. The work bell rings. Your hands already ache, but you step forward. Because you must. Because everyone else does. And because Ankar is always watching. Next, we'll explore what people wore, what they ate, and what life looked like, stripped to its barest form. The essentials of survival under Pol Pot's revolution. Imagine waking every morning knowing that the most pressing question of your day is not your work or your safety or even your freedom. It's food. What will you eat? Will there be enough? Under Pol Pot's regime, the idea was radical simplicity. A society stripped of hierarchy, wealth, and identity. Everyone equal, everyone poor, everyone obedient. That simplicity showed itself most clearly in two things: clothing and meals. Let's start with what you wore. Gone were the colours of tradition, the brilliant silks, the golden embroidery, the delicate patterns passed down through generations. Gone were Western-style outfits, even school uniforms or jewellery. Now, everyone wore black. Black cotton shirts and trousers, loose-fitting and plain, symbolic of the peasant, practical for work, devoid of individuality, children, elders, teachers, farmers, even doctors, all of them in the same rough black cloth. No shoes, unless you made your own from scraps. No belts, unless you tied a rope around your waist. No pockets, unless you stitched them yourself. Hair was cut short, especially for women. Long hair, once a source of beauty and pride, was discouraged or shaved. Simplicity was control. Imagine a sea of people in the rice fields, identical from a distance. No jewellery, no makeup, no mirrors. You might not recognise your own reflection if you ever saw it again. Then there was the food. Meals were taken not at home but in communal eating halls, simple huts with wooden benches, often open to the wind and insects. Families could not eat together. Meals were regulated, observed and rationed. There was one main dish, rice porridge. Bor, as it was called, was rice cooked with so much water it became soupy. Thin, sometimes translucent. A single ladle per person, 2 if the harvest had been good, though it rarely was. If you were lucky, the porridge had bits of boiled pumpkin, maybe a few slivers of banana tree trunk or a pinch of salt. Protein was rare and precious. Perhaps a dried fish, the size of your palm, shared among many. Meat, an unimaginable luxury. Most people had long forgotten its taste. Vegetables came from foraging, wild roots, leaves, even tree bark. People boiled grasses, picked water lilies, chewed on sugar cane husks for fleeting sweetness. To fill their stomachs, some swallowed clay or stole animal feed, or ate insects, crickets, frogs, beetles, anything they could catch. But if caught, punishment was severe. You were accused of private eating, a crime in a society that demanded total obedience. Even being seen with a second helping could bring suspicion. There were no snacks, no spices, no treats, just enough, barely, to keep the body moving. The hunger became part of you. It slowed your walk, dimmed your eyes, took the lightness out of your laughter. Your body learned to endure it, even when your mind rebelled. And yet, within this world of bare essentials, people found small acts of resistance. A woman might sew a hidden pocket inside her shirt to keep a fragment of dried fish for her child. A boy might sneak a handful of uncooked rice from the storehouse. A grandmother might whisper the recipe for a mok, Cambodia's beloved coconut fish curry, into a sleeping child's ear. Not to eat, but to remember, to keep something alive that Ankar had tried to erase. Because food is more than sustenance, it's memory, culture, love. And even in the darkest times, the memory of a meal once shared can become a form of survival. So, imagine again. A bowl of porridge, warm but tasteless. A black shirt drying in the sun. The sound of a spoon scraping the bottom of a wooden bowl. That was daily life. Simple, uniform, silent. But under the surface, an entire people held onto fragments of flavour, colour and identity. They were starved, but not entirely erased. Next, we'll step into a darker place. A former school, transformed into one of the regime's most terrifying symbols, S21. Where walls once echoed with children's laughter, now held only silence and screams. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a school. Not just any school, a place full of chatter, chalk dust, open windows and eager hands raised in the air. Picture tile floors, the rhythmic clatter of feet running to recess, the sharp ring of the bell that signals the start of the day. Now, strip it of all that life. Take away the children, take away the books, the lessons, the warmth. Replace the desks with rusted beds, the blackboards with barbed wire. Replace laughter with silence. This is S21, also known as Tool Sleng. It was once a high school in Phnom Penh, set among quiet neighbourhoods and leafy trees. But in 1975, under Pol Pot's new order, the school was converted into a prison, one of the regime's most feared. S21 became a symbol, not of learning, but of suspicion and death. It wasn't the only prison in Cambodia, but it was perhaps the most systematic. You wouldn't know it was a prison from the outside. There were no towering walls or foreboding gates. But once you stepped through the entrance, the air changed. It became heavy, still, the kind of silence that holds memory. Each classroom was transformed, some into cells, narrow and suffocating with shackles bolted to the floor, others into interrogation rooms or storage for confessions. Windows were covered with iron bars and barbed wire, not to keep people out, but to keep prisoners from leaping to their deaths. Because some tried. Imagine yourself inside one of these rooms. The concrete is stained. The metal bed frame rusts in one corner. There is a single chair, a desk, a whip, a set of tools, and nothing else. This was where Angkar sent those suspected of betrayal. And betrayal meant almost anything. A former teacher, a doctor, a student, a party member who once said the wrong thing, a man with a pair of glasses, a woman who had cried too long at a funeral. No trial, no lawyer, no defence, only accusation and confession. Torture was used not to punish, but to extract. Prisoners were forced to name others, to sign false admissions, to speak until they broke. Many confessed crimes they never committed, and once they did, they were taken away. Most prisoners at S21 never left. They were executed shortly after, buried in mass graves at the nearby Chung Ek killing fields. But among the few who survived was Van Nath, a painter. When Van Nath was arrested, he had no idea why. Like so many others, he was simply taken. He endured the interrogations, the accusations, the beatings. But then, something unexpected. He was spared. The regime had discovered he was an artist, and they had a use for him. They ordered him to paint portraits of Pol Pot, smiling portraits, glorified images of the man who led this silent war against his own people. So Van Nath lived, in a room near the prison's heart. Each day he painted the face of the man responsible for everything happening around him, and each night he heard the screams. Later Van Nath would speak softly of those nights, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a kind of reverent sadness, a grief too large for words. When the regime fell, Van Nath became one of the few witnesses who could say, "I saw it. I lived through it. Let me show you what it was." He returned to Tool Sleng, and he painted again. But this time, he painted not leaders, but the victims, the torture, the cells, the faces of the nameless, who could no longer speak for themselves. His art remains there to this day, on the walls of what is now the Tool Sleng Genocide Museum. You can walk through those classrooms, you can see the beds, the shackles, the photos, because the Khmer Rouge documented everything. They took photographs of each prisoner, men, women, children, thousands of faces, staring into the camera with a mixture of fear, confusion, and resignation. Each photograph, a moment suspended in time, a face once full of dreams. You might find yourself standing before one, feeling a quiet weight in your chest, and realizing that the scariest part is not what you see, is what you feel missing, the echo of a school bell, the footsteps of children, the voices that will never return. And yet, in the stillness of those halls, the silence now serves a different purpose. It remembers. Next, we turn to the fear that kept this machine running, the whispers, the watchers, the invisible web of surveillance that touched every village, every hut, every life. Imagine living in a place where you cannot trust anyone, not your neighbour, not your friend, not even your own child. This was the world Pol Pot created, not only one of visible control but of invisible fear, a world where every word mattered, every glance, every gesture, where silence was often the only safe language. The Khmer Rouge, in its quest for absolute purity and loyalty, did not rely solely on military force. Instead, they used a more insidious tool, surveillance, not through cameras, not through technology, but through people. Imagine yourself sitting by the low fire outside your hut. You're eating your bowl of thin porridge. The stars blink gently above, and the wind rustles through the sugar palms. Next to you, someone shifts. Maybe it's your cousin, or your friend from childhood. Maybe it's a child squatting nearby in the dust. And then they speak casually. What did you think of the meeting today? Just a question. Innocent. Maybe. But if you answer honestly, and that answer is not perfectly in line with Ankara, it could be reported. The child might tell their cadre leader, the friend might whisper it later in the fields, and the cousin? Perhaps they too are trying to survive. Everyone was a potential informant. Every commune had a network, people tasked with watching others, reporting disobedience, spreading suspicion. Cadres listened for any signs of dissent, however small, and no one was above suspicion. People were encouraged to report each other, often under the belief that doing so would protect themselves or their families, but it rarely did. Even family bonds were severed. Husbands stopped confiding in wives. Parents avoided speaking to their children about the past. Children were taught that the only parent they truly had was Ankar. Don't trust the old people, they were told. They are impure, corrupted by the past. This atmosphere of paranoia was not an accident. It was design. By sowing fear into every relationship, the regime ensured control without the need for constant violence. You simply didn't need to resist, because you couldn't even think about it. If someone in your work unit disappeared, you said nothing. If a neighbour was taken in the night, you turned your eyes to the ground. If a rumour reached you about rice theft or secret songs, or prayers whispered after dark, you forgot it immediately, because memory could kill. Imagine how heavy it must feel to carry your own thoughts like contraband, to speak only in approved phrases, to smile only when expected, to watch your words like they were knives pointed back at you. This wasn't only a war of weapons, it was a war on trust, and it was everywhere. Even in the forests, the paddies, the fields, even in sleep. In some villages, people stopped speaking entirely, outside of assigned roles. They communicated in gestures or short commands. When a person vanished, others were told, "He has gone to study. He has gone to work for Ankar." But everyone knew what it really meant. Still, no one asked questions. Because in a society where everyone is watching, and no one is safe, even curiosity is dangerous. Yet, despite this crushing silence, tiny flickers of human spirit remained. A mother might find a way to sing a lullaby beneath her breath. A friend might pass a subtle glance, a shared moment of empathy that said, "I see you." An old man might carve a message onto a tree, knowing it may never be read. These were small, invisible acts of resistance, proof that even in a system built on fear, the human desire for connection quietly endured. So the next time you hear someone laugh freely or speak openly without fear, remember that in Cambodia during these years, such a moment could cost a life. Next, we will walk into the daily rhythm of life once more, not through what people feared, but through what they endured physically, the long grinding labour under the unrelenting sun. Now, imagine waking up before the sun has even lifted its pale face above the horizon. The air is damp with morning mist. Your body aches from yesterday and the day before that, You stretch quietly, careful not to wake others crowded beside you on the bamboo floor. There is no breakfast, just the dull rumble of your stomach, a sensation so constant now it's become a background hum. Outside, the sound of footsteps begins. Rubber sandals on packed earth, the clink of farming tools, the muted coughs of those too weak to suppress it. This is the start of the day, for millions under Pol Pot's rule. The Khmer Rouge envisioned a peasant utopia, and to build it, every Cambodian became a labourer, assigned to work not for personal gain but for the collective. But collective meant obedience, and labour meant suffering. Children, elders, the sick. No one was exempt. Everyone was sorted into work brigades, organised by age and gender, often sent far from home. Families were split. Husbands didn't see wives. Mothers rarely saw their children. Your job might change with the week, or the whim of your cadre. You might find yourself digging canals, hauling baskets of earth under the burning sun, planting rice in flooded fields, water up to your chest, or clearing forests, hacking through thick vegetation with bare hands and dull machetes. The work was relentless. 12 hours a day, sometimes more, and for this, you received a ladle of rice porridge, thin, bland, often spoiled, sometimes stretched with leaves or grasses just to make it look like more. The goal of the regime was self-sufficiency, but what they produced in ideology, they lacked in food, and so the people starved. Imagine the slow dulling of your body. Your limbs feel heavy, your breath shortens, you catch illnesses easily, malaria, dysentery, skin infections. There is no medicine, no rest days. You work until you collapse, and when you collapse, someone else takes your place. The camps were not enclosed by fences but by hopelessness. Escape was nearly impossible, and punishment was swift. No one knew who might report them. And even if you fled, where would you go? The entire country was a prison without walls. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Water came from dirty canals. Sleeping quarters were crowded, infested with insects, and rarely dry. And yet, there was no complaint, because complaint was dangerous. People learned to say they were grateful, that they were proud to build a new Cambodia, that their suffering had purpose, and deep down, some believed it, or wanted to, because believing meant there was at least a reason behind it all. But there was no glory in those trenches, only bodies. In many villages, people began dying quietly, one by one, from exhaustion, from infection, from starvation. You might not even get a burial, just a shallow grave, a footpath worn smooth by other tired steps passing over it. There were no names, no farewells, only absence, still. Each morning, the work continued. The rhythm of life became work, hunger, and silence. Yet in this rhythm, people still found moments, brief, flickering, to be human. A stolen piece of fruit, a shared joke whispered under breath, a hand offered to lift a fallen comrade. These were the invisible resistances, the small kindnesses that made the difference between giving up and continuing. So now, as you lie still and listen to this story, imagine again that sun rising over a muddy rice field. Picture a line of figures walking slowly across the horizon. Their clothes are threadbare, their backs are bent, but somewhere inside each, a spark remains. Next, we'll examine the psychology of survival, not what people did, but how they lived with the fear that surrounded them. A world where saying the wrong word could mean your last. Try, if you will, to picture a life where silence is not simply preferred but required, where even your thoughts, if they could be heard, might betray you. This was the Cambodia of Pol Pot, not just a place of forced labour and hollowed villages, but a place where fear became the very air people breathed. You've heard already of the informants, the labour camps, the starvation. But perhaps the most powerful tool of the Khmer Rouge was not their guns, or even their ideology. It was this, a strategy of sustained, invisible fear. Imagine it now. You're sitting on the edge of a wooden platform, your bare feet dusted with the dry, cracked earth. The evening is coming on softly, blue shadows stretching, the faint buzz of insects building around you, and no one speaks. The silence isn't peaceful, it is dense, like something pressing down from above. You glance sideways, careful not to meet anyone's gaze for too long. Even your eyes could say too much. This was the rhythm of their days. Not just hunger or exhaustion, but a kind of mental restraint, a learned behaviour, etched slowly over time that taught people to flatten themselves, to speak only when required, and always with the approved phrases, "I am grateful to Ankar," "I am loyal to the revolution," "I am happy to build the future." Even if your heart told you otherwise, your mouth learned the script. Because deviation from the words, the posture, the expectation was dangerous. In this world, fear was preventative. It didn't need to punish everyone, only a few. The stories travelled faster than the executions, a whispered tale of someone taken at night, a shadow that vanished, a hut left empty by morning. No one ever explained where they went. They didn't have to. And so the fear grew large enough to enforce its own rules, to regulate thought, to smooth out the edges of personality, to extinguish individuality. Even laughter became suspicious. Children, too young to remember freedom, grew up under this silence. They knew better than to ask about the past. Their songs were rewritten with revolutionary lyrics. Their games became drills. Their eyes watched carefully. You see, fear wasn't only personal, it was collective. People were not just afraid for themselves, but for each other. If you spoke too freely and someone overheard, you might not be punished. They might. And so it became a kind of shared code. Do not speak. Do not ask. Do not feel too much. Some began to police their own families. A woman might see her husband grow thin and distant and say nothing. A man might hear his daughter recite party slogans with mechanical pride and feel a quiet ache, but say nothing. Not because they didn't care, but because caring had become dangerous. This fear was layered and subtle, and it worked. It kept people in line far more effectively than brute violence alone ever could. In time, the outer signs of fear became indistinguishable from loyalty. A bowed head, an eager nod, the repetition of party slogans. Were they believers or simply survivors? Often there was no way to know. That was the genius and cruelty of the Khmer Rouge's strategy. They didn't need to control every thought. They only needed to make you afraid of your own mind. And so you censored yourself. You erased memories. You repeated lies until they felt safe enough to hold. But somewhere, buried deep, your truth remained. A name you refused to forget. A moment of beauty you dared to remember. A story you kept hidden, not from pride, but to protect it from erasure. Even in silence, something endured, and that is important. Because what the Khmer Rouge feared most in the end was not defiance, it was memory. In the next segment, we'll explore another facet of this unspoken war, how intellect itself became dangerous, and how something as small as wearing glasses could mark you for death. Picture this. You're standing in line under the midday sun. The earth is hot beneath your feet, dry and cracked. You squint, instinctively lifting a hand to shade your eyes. But a soldier notices. He steps closer. Not because you've spoken out, not because you've misbehaved, but because of one simple, unchangeable thing. You're wearing glasses. In Pol Pot's Cambodia, that was enough. Glasses, books, soft hands uncalloused by labour, the way you walked, the way you spoke, even the way you held yourself, if it hinted at education, was seen as a threat. Imagine that. The very signs of learning that marked you for suspicion. Because in the radical eyes of the Khmer Rouge, intelligence meant disobedience. And disobedience, no matter how quiet, no matter how imagined, meant death. Their dream was simple, a classless peasant society, a nation of workers and farmers, no cities, no schools, no universities, no professors, no lawyers, no doctors, no thinkers. To create this, they didn't just ban education, they hunted it. Libraries were emptied, books were burned, typewriters were smashed, blackboards were painted over, schools became prison halls, and teachers, those once entrusted to shape the minds of the young, were among the first to disappear. You could be accused of being bourgeois for simply speaking French, for knowing how to read, for having studied abroad, or worse, for having once worked in a bank, a hospital, or a ministry. Even memories were dangerous. If your neighbours remembered you had once been a teacher, or a student, or anything more than a farmer, that too could seal your fate. So people erased themselves. They forgot their own pasts. A man who had once taught philosophy learned to carry baskets. A woman who had written poems burned them silently by night. A student who had dreamed of science now tended to rice seedlings in silence. And those who couldn't hide, who wore their education in their mannerisms, in their posture, in their vocabulary, often did not survive. Imagine being punished not for what you did, but for what you knew. And yet, people still found ways to remember. Words were shared in whispers. Songs were passed in code. Lessons were given at night, in shadows under blankets between trusted hearts. Because even as the regime tried to extinguish knowledge, the human mind continued to seek it. A mother taught her child to count using pebbles behind the house. A man remembered entire pages of poetry, not because he expected to share them, but because forgetting felt like another kind of death. This quiet resistance, the refusal to forget, the desperate urge to hold on to meaning, was as powerful as any act of rebellion. And when you understand this, you begin to see the Khmer Rouge's cruelty in full. It wasn't just the killing, it was the erasure of thought, of culture, of memory. But ideas like seeds do not die easily. Even when buried deep, they wait for rain, wait for light, wait for freedom. In the next segment, we'll look at how the regime took its most impressionable citizens, children, and turned them into tools of enforcement. How families were fractured, and trust, even between parent and child, began to fade. Imagine, if you can, the sound of children's voices, but not in play, not in laughter or song. These voices chant slogans, they speak of loyalty to Angkar, they recite names, sometimes they report. This was the soundscape of Cambodia in the late 1970s. Children were not spared the revolution. In fact, they were among its most effective tools. The Khmer Rouge leadership understood something chillingly simple. Children can be moulded. They do not question as easily. They learn quickly. They can be trained to believe anything if you start early enough. And so they did. From the youngest age, children were taken from their families. Boys and girls as young as 6 or 7 were organised into mobile units, labour groups and children's collectives. They were given roles, tasks, duties. They harvested rice, built dams, carried messages, and later, some of them, armed with rifles that seemed far too large for their thin arms, were trained as soldiers. The Khmer Rouge called it creating the new people, but in truth they were uncreating childhood itself. Imagine now a small boy, barefoot, walking along an irrigation ditch. He carries a flag in one hand, a bag of grain in the other. His face is blank. He's repeating a song, something he was taught to sing in the morning drills. He doesn't ask where his parents are. He knows not to ask. Parents were no longer safe harbours for their children. In fact, the regime encouraged children to denounce them. Trust became a threat. If your son or daughter overheard you speaking doubtfully of Angkar, if they told their collective supervisor, even proudly, you might vanish before sunrise. And so families fractured not only in space but in spirit. Parents learned to guard their words, even around their own blood. Some mothers stopped calling their children by pet names, afraid it might seem too affectionate. Fathers looked into the eyes of their sons and saw not love, but a glint of suspicion. This was not a world of broken homes. It was a world where the idea of home itself was dismantled. The regime wanted total loyalty, and they believed the family unit, with its private affections and old bonds, stood in the way, so they targeted it. Marriages were arranged by the state, often en masse, dozens of couples at a time paired off like soldiers. Romance, intimacy, and choice were seen as bourgeois distractions. Even pregnancy was politicized. Children were born not to families but to the revolution. Some parents saw their children only as distant figures, walking in step with youth groups dressed in black pajamas, eyes hardening too early. Others never saw them again. The pain of separation was often silent, unspoken, but deep. Years later, survivors would recall the sting not just of the loss, but of watching their children become strangers. Yet within this darkness, there were still flickers of quiet love. Some mothers risked everything to pass a scrap of food. Some fathers whispered a story in the dead of night just once, knowing it might be the only memory that endured. And even among the children, those taught to inform, to obey, to chant, there were those who doubted, who hesitated, who held back, small rebellions of the heart. In the next segment, we'll explore how the regime's effort to destroy the old world didn't stop with family. It extended to the very soul of the country, its culture, its religion, its sacred places. Imagine yourself walking through an ancient Cambodian temple at dusk. The air is warm and still. The sandstone walls, weathered, moss-dappled, bear silent witness to centuries of belief. A bell used to chime here. Chanting once echoed from the halls. Now, there is only dust. This is not a ruin from long ago. This was Cambodia during the rule of the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot and his regime didn't just want to change Cambodia, they wanted to erase everything it had been. They called it cleansing. Cleansing the country of the past, its traditions, its beauty, its soul. Culture was seen as dangerous, religion, treasonous, and so they turned on both. Temples were stripped, monasteries were abandoned, statues of the Buddha were toppled, buried, or shattered, sacred texts were used as kindling, and the saffron robes of monks, once a common sight, vanished from the streets. Imagine, if you can, a land without prayer. Cambodia, once among the most devout Buddhist nations in the world, was forced into silence. Thousands of monks were defrocked, forced into labour camps, or quietly disappeared. To meditate was now a crime. To bow in reverence, a mark of counter-revolutionary thinking. Even ancestral worship along a thread in Cambodian village life was forbidden. No offerings, no incense, no whispered names of the dead at family altars. Imagine how disorienting that must have been. Generations had relied on these rituals to make sense of life and death, joy and sorrow. To take them away was to unmoor the soul. And yet the regime's erasure did not end there. Dance, once a sacred expression of Cambodia's spirit, was now declared irrelevant. The Apsara, those celestial dancers carved into Angkor's stones, were relics of a feudal past. Musicians were silenced, poets silenced, painters and scholars silenced. It was a systematic unmaking of identity, a quiet war on memory, and yet, despite it all, fragments remained. Some villagers, when no one watched, traced sacred symbols into the earth. Some monks, hidden in plain clothes, remembered chants in their hearts, and some artists, their hands rough from digging trenches, dreamed in colours no one could see. These acts, small, defiant, invisible, were seeds. Seeds that would later grow again. But during the reign of the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia's cultural soil lay scorched. The world of temples and tales and teachings had turned to dust, and in that dust, many people searched, quietly, for meaning. In the next segment, we will listen to the voices that survived, the ones who lived to tell, to remember, and to quietly mourn. Imagine yourself sitting beside a quiet river. The water moves slowly. The breeze carries only the soft rustle of leaves, and beside you someone begins to speak. Not loudly, not urgently, just softly and honestly. This is how we might begin to hear the stories of survivors. Amid the vastness of Cambodia's loss, it is sometimes easy to forget that individuals lived through it. Real people, flesh and bone, memory and feeling, who saw what happened with their own eyes, and who, years later, were able to find the words to describe it. Let us first meet Chum May, a quiet man with deep-set eyes and hands weathered by time. Before the Khmer Rouge came to power, he worked as a mechanic in Phnom Penh. He repaired typewriters, machines that clicked and hummed and responded to touch, machines that, ironically, would later be used to document lives and deaths. When the regime took over, Chum May, like so many others, was arrested and brought to S21, the infamous prison known for silence, suffering and shadows. It is hard to imagine what he saw there, but what saved him was his skill. The guards discovered he could fix machinery, and so he was spared, day after day, not out of mercy, but usefulness. Chum May survived where over 14,000 others did not. He would later recall the loneliness most of all, the sounds of footsteps echoing through halls where people disappeared without a word, the fear that clung to the walls like dust. He did not escape through defiance. He survived through stillness, through endurance. Years later, he would return to S21, now a museum, and sit in the same rooms where he had once trembled. Not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the weight of memory. Then there is Lung Ung. She was just a child when Phnom Penh was emptied, 5 years old, barely old enough to tie her own shoes when the soldiers came, her family walked for days under the sun, forced from their home into the countryside. Like thousands of others, they were separated, reshaped, erased. Laung would eventually survive. She fled, she learned, and years later, she wrote. Her words, gentle, clear, and full of feeling, took the shape of her childhood, the hunger, the confusion, the little games she played with pebbles and shadows to forget the silence around her. But what makes Laung's story so powerful is not just what she endured, it's how she remembers. She does not describe rage. She describes moments, small ones. A sister's hand holding hers, the sound of frogs at night, the colour of rice porridge on an empty morning. It's in these details that the past becomes real, not grand speeches or headlines, but the texture of lived experience. Listening to these survivors, we do not hear shouting. We hear pauses. We hear breaths. We hear a long, slow unfolding of something too large to say all at once. Their stories do not wake us. They guide us gently, toward understanding, toward a kind of quiet empathy. And so, as we drift with these memories, soft and sorrowful, we prepare to enter the next phase of life under the Khmer Rouge. Not through individuals, but through the machine they served, a faceless system that reached into every village, every home, and every heartbeat. Imagine yourself in a village, a quiet place, wooden houses raised on stilts. Children once played beneath them. Chickens wandered between trees. The air is warm, the sky pale. But now, something is different. There is no music, no laughter, only whispers. And overhead, a word moves like wind through the leaves. Angkar. It means the organisation. But it wasn't just a word. It was a presence. No one saw the Angkar, and yet it was everywhere. It decided who lived where, what you could eat, what job you would do, who you could love, and whether you would see tomorrow. No names, no photographs, no appeal, only orders, passed from village chiefs to district officers to unknown figures far above. In many ways, Angkar was a concept more than a government, an invisible authority that discouraged questions and punished curiosity. It claimed to know all, to see all, to protect and purify. People spoke of it with reverence and fear. It is better to trust Angkar than your own family, they were told. Angkar has the eyes of the pineapple, a phrase that echoed across rice fields and labour camps. It meant that even if you couldn't see Angkar, it could see you. And so, silence became survival. People learned not to speak their thoughts, even to their own spouses, not to smile too widely, not to frown too deeply, to exist in neutrality. Even children learned the rules. They recited slogans in unison, swearing loyalty to Angkar. Sometimes they informed on their parents, believing they were doing what was right. There was no space for the individual, only the collective, only Angkar. If someone disappeared in the night, neighbours said nothing. If someone wept too loudly, others looked away. The machine had no heart, no face, only gears turning in silence. Orders were carried out mechanically without explanation. You might be sent to the fields, or to a new village, or to a place from which no one returned, and you would not know why. Imagine living in a world where your thoughts, harmless thoughts, might betray you, where kindness could seem suspicious, where memory itself was dangerous. This was the nature of Angkar, and yet, even within such control, a strange kind of daily life persisted. People woke, they worked, they ate when they could, they dreamed when no one watched, because even under the weight of faceless power, the human spirit does not vanish. It bends, it hides, it waits. In the next segment, we will follow those quiet glimmers of defiance, small, nearly invisible acts of resistance that survived beneath the machine's shadow. Let's now walk softly into the hush beneath oppression, where silence was not surrender, and where resistance did not roar, but whispered, where defiance wore no uniform, held no weapons, but waited quietly like breath held just beneath the surface. Imagine a world where a poem could cost you your life, where to sing an old lullaby, to hum an ancient melody, to speak a line from a sacred text, was to risk vanishing, and yet some still did. In Pol Pot's Cambodia, Resistance did not look like it does in films. There were no fiery speeches, no mass uprisings. The cost of open rebellion was far too high. So resistance took other forms. Imagine an old man in the fields. He's stooped, sun-darkened, his hands roughened by days of digging. He moves slowly, his head down, but in his mind he's reciting verses he learned as a boy, lines from ancient Khmer epics passed down through generations. No one hears them, but they live on, inside him. Or a mother feeding her child with the last scoop of rice porridge, humming a tune that once echoed through Buddhist ceremonies. The melody, low and soft, blends with the evening air. Or a village woman weaving a scarf, not of party colours, but in the old patterns her grandmother taught her. The cloth is plain, but in its threads a memory and quiet refusal. There were even those who buried manuscripts in earthen jars beneath their homes, or etched prayers onto wood, hidden in ceilings and under floorboards, not because they thought the regime would end soon, but because they believed someone, someday, would need to know. There were secret monks, disguised as farmers. There were teachers who, while digging canals or tending crops, quietly corrected myths and lies whispered by cadres, not to argue, just to remember the truth, to hold a candle, unseen. And there were children, especially the very young, who still whispered the names of the old gods when no one listened. Their words were not political, they were instinctual. They carried what they could not yet understand. Even a glance could be an act of defiance, a moment of eye contact between two workers in the field. Not long, just enough to say, "I see you. I remember you. We are still here." These gestures may seem small, but in a world so carefully controlled, even breathing a forbidden thought became an act of courage. It is easy to forget these quiet forms of resistance. History often remembers only the loud, the visible, the triumphant. But here, in the stillness of Cambodia's most silent years, these whispers mattered. They kept the soul of a people intact, and when the machine finally began to break, when the regime began to falter, it was these memories, these melodies, these hidden seeds of identity that helped the people begin again. Soon, we will speak of how that collapse began, when the storm rolled in from the east and the invaders came. But for now, let us linger a little longer with the whisperers, the keepers of memory, the ones who dared to hold on to who they were. Let us move now, slowly into the beginning of the end. Not with celebration or sudden joy, but with quiet footsteps through the ruins of a broken dream. When the silence of oppression was met by a different kind of silence, the silence that follows when something terrible finally begins to fall apart. Imagine the land, still and tense. It is late 1978. The skies above Cambodia are heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The air is dry. Rice fields lay flattened after seasons of forced labour. Villages sit quietly under low clouds, and along the border, something stirs. From the east, a different army begins to move. Vietnamese soldiers, not marching to conquer, but to intervene. Not welcomed by all, but neither entirely feared. Their presence marked a shift, one that would be felt slowly, and then suddenly. For years, tensions between Cambodia and Vietnam had escalated. Pol Pot, ever suspicious, had sent his troops across the border more than once. Raids, skirmishes, killings. Vietnam responded, not just with patrols, but with a plan. A full invasion. It began in December of 1978, and by early January they were advancing deep into Cambodian territory. Khmer Rouge forces, caught off guard and poorly supplied, began to crumble under the pressure. Then came January 7th, 1979. Phnom Penh, once emptied of its people, was now emptied of its rulers. Imagine standing at the edge of that city as the Vietnamese rolled in. Tanks passed crumbling buildings, rusted school signs, and broken statues once meant to inspire fear. The streets were almost eerily quiet. There was no grand battle for the capital. The Khmer Rouge had fled. In their place, the remnants of a people stepped cautiously from the shadows. Men and women emerged from forests and fields. Children clung to elders they barely knew. Some had heard rumours, others simply followed their feet. And slowly, life crept back into the skeleton of a city. But what they found was desolation. Hospitals without medicine, schools used as prisons, houses stripped bare, and silence, deep and echoing, across entire neighbourhoods. Imagine returning to your childhood home, only to find strangers, or nothing at all, no photos, no voices, no walls. This was the strange shape of liberation. It was not joyous, it was disorienting. For many Cambodians, the arrival of Vietnamese forces was not a celebration, but a breath. A long, uncertain breath after years of suffocation. Vietnam helped install a new government, one made of former Khmer Rouge defectors who had fled earlier. They called it the People's Republic of Kampuchea. It would take years for Cambodia to begin its recovery, and the Khmer Rouge, though driven into hiding, would not disappear immediately. They lingered in border regions, they regrouped in jungles, and their presence remained like a shadow on the land. But for now, in early 1979, there was a beginning, a slow, fragile beginning. The labour camps were abandoned, the loudspeakers went quiet, the slogans faded, and people began to speak again, not in whispers, but in full voices, though hesitant at first. The regime that had controlled every movement, every meal, every word, was gone. And in its place only questions remained. Where were the missing? How many were left? How had they survived? These questions would echo for decades, and some answers would come only with time. In the next segment, we will walk into those answers, not through witness, but through discovery, through the uncovering of the killing fields, those places where the land itself had held its breath, waiting to speak. Let us now step gently into the quiet fields where the grass grows thick and the wind carries more than air, where the soil does not forget, where the earth, when asked, answers in bones. After the fall of the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia was hushed in grief and confusion. For many, the worst was over, yet the depth of what had happened had not yet been fully understood. The terror had been hidden in shadows, in whispers, and in the places where no one dared to go. But in the months that followed the Vietnamese liberation, the land began to speak. It started slowly. Farmers, returning to work the soil, noticed strange mounds, a hand protruding from the earth, bits of fabric, faded and frayed, barely visible beneath a crust of dry dust. The smell of decay in places where no animals had died. These were not accidents. They were graves, but not individual ones, not marked by name. These were mass graves, sites where hundreds, sometimes thousands, had been buried together in silence. Imagine walking through one of these places for the first time, the ground uneven, disturbed by time and tragedy. The air still and thick with humidity, each step a whisper, each whisper a cry held beneath layers of soil. These places became known in time as the killing fields. There were hundreds of them scattered across Cambodia, in forests, behind schools, near temples, by rivers and ponds, each one a silent witness to what had been done. One of the most infamous was Choeung Ek, located just outside Phnom Penh. Today, it is a memorial site, but in 1979, it was a raw wound. When the Vietnamese and the new Cambodian government arrived, they began the somber work of uncovering the truth. Teams were assembled, the ground was carefully excavated, bones were counted, skulls were catalogued, and stories began to emerge, not from survivors this time, but from the very landscape. Some sites revealed the remains of children, others showed rows of adults bound at the wrists, blindfolded, stacked, layered. Often the bodies bore no signs of gunfire. Bullets were considered too valuable, so other means had been used. Tools from farms, implements from workshops, blunt, cruel, silent. Even trees bore witness. At Choeung Ek, one tree still stands, its bark rough and grey. Locals call it the killing tree. It is said that soldiers used it to end the lives of the very youngest. Though the details are mercifully faded in official language, the sorrow remains. Imagine standing there, hearing nothing but the soft rustling of leaves, and yet feeling as though the earth beneath you remembers every cry. The discovery of the killing fields shocked the world. International reporters, aid workers, and investigators who entered Cambodia in the early 1980s encountered these sites firsthand. Photos were taken, reports were written, and still, the numbers were difficult to grasp. An estimated 1.7 to 2 million people had died under the Khmer Rouge, many of them here, in these unmarked places. Some had died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, but many, too many, had died by deliberate execution. And so these fields became more than just graves. They became testimonies, proof against denial, voices for those who had none. Today, many of these sites remain untouched, respectfully preserved. Visitors come not in crowds but in reverence. Shoes are removed, heads are bowed, and sometimes among the fallen leaves, a piece of cloth or bone still rises from the soil, as if reaching for remembrance. The killing fields were never meant to be found, but the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of rising. And now, with the evidence laid bare, a new question emerged. Who would answer for this? Let us now, slowly, carefully, walk into the next chapter. When the world turned its gaze toward justice, and the long, complex process of reckoning began, and so, from the quiet stillness of the fields, we moved gently toward the slow turning of another wheel, the wheel of justice. For years the truth lay beneath the soil, but truth, once unearthed, asks for more than remembrance, it asks for accountability. Imagine 2 decades of silence, 20 years after the fall of the Khmer Rouge. Survivors aged, memories softened at the edges, but the weight of the past never truly lightened. By the early 2000s, Cambodia stood as a nation still healing, its scars visible not only in broken buildings or rural poverty, but in the quiet heaviness that hung over many conversations. There were still questions, still names whispered, still men who walked freely even as the ghosts of their deeds stirred in the wind. Among them was a name once barely known to the outside world. Kang Kek Yew, more commonly known by his revolutionary alias, Douche. Duc had overseen S-21, the former high school turned interrogation centre we visited earlier. He was not a warlord, not a soldier in the field. He was a record keeper, an administrator of suffering, the kind of man who wrote lists, catalogued lives, and watched them disappear. And yet, after the fall of the regime, he had vanished, lived quietly, even taught mathematics in remote areas. It was only in 1999, nearly 20 years after the regime's collapse, that Duc was finally found, living under a false name. His arrest marked a turning point, not just for him, but for Cambodia and for the memory of those who had perished. In 2006, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, often simply called the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, was formally established. It was a hybrid court, part Cambodian, part international, designed not for revenge, but for justice, measured, deliberate justice. The trials began slowly. Witnesses were called, many of them elderly by then. Records were examined, translations were read aloud in soft, steady tones, and on March 30th, 2009, Duc sat before the court. His expression was calm, almost blank. He acknowledged responsibility, but not always guilt. You can imagine the courtroom. Simple wooden chairs, translators seated behind glass, survivors clutching photographs of lost brothers, mothers, sons. The room was quiet. Grief, when long carried, has no need to shout. Duc was convicted in 2010 of crimes against humanity and war crimes. He was sentenced to 35 years, later extended to life imprisonment. He would die in prison in 2020, but he was not the only one. Other leaders were also tried. Nuon Chea, Pol Pot's right-hand man, Khieu Samphan, the regime's nominal head of state. They too faced the court. And though time had aged them, white-haired, frail, in wheelchairs, the court proceeded slowly, respectfully. In 2018, both were found guilty of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. Pol Pot himself, however, would never stand trial. He died in 1998 in a remote jungle hut, his final years spent under house arrest. A strange, anticlimactic end for a man whose ideology had caused such sweeping devastation. And so, justice came, not quickly, not completely, but purposefully. For some survivors, the trials offered a sense of closure. For others, it felt too little, too late. After all, no sentence could bring back the 2 million lives lost, or erase the fear that had once wrapped around daily life like a second skin. Yet still, there was a quiet dignity in the process, a reminder that even decades after horror, truth can still be spoken aloud, and names, both of victims and perpetrators, can be remembered not just in sorrow, but in history. From here, we now move gently to how Cambodians remember this past, to the commemorations that take place not with anger, but with reflection. Let us now step into May 20th, a day that once burned with fury, but today hums softly with remembrance. And so the courtroom doors slowly closed, the voices of witnesses echoing faintly behind them. But the story did not end there, for justice is not only found in verdicts and sentences, sometimes it lives in how a people choose to remember. Let us now walk into a quieter space, a space shaped not by trials, but by memory, by rituals, by reflection, by a single day that gathers all the years into itself. Every year, as the month of May deepens into its warmest days, a hush seems to settle over Cambodia. A hush filled not with silence, but with memory. On May 20th, the nation pauses. It is a day once called the Day of Hatred, but now it has evolved into something more solemn, less about vengeance and more about remembrance. The origins of this day stretch back to the early 1980s. In the immediate aftermath of the Khmer Rouge, the Vietnamese-backed Cambodian government instituted this national day to honour those who had died and to publicly denounce the crimes of the regime. Initially, the tone was fierce. Marches, banners, speeches filled with anger. It was a form of catharsis for a wounded population. The phrase used in the early ceremonies was sharp: "We will never forgive, never forget." But time changes things. Wounds scab over, even if they do not vanish. And slowly, the Day of Hatred softened. It became less about hate and more about healing. Today, in many parts of Cambodia, May 20th is marked with quiet rituals, simple ceremonies, offerings of incense, bowls of jasmine rice placed at temple steps, photographs held close to the heart. Monks chant in low, echoing tones. Families gather near stupas and memorials. Names are spoken aloud, even if the bodies were never found. Imagine yourself in such a gathering. The early morning sun filters through palm trees. The scent of burning incense curls in the air. Children fidget at the edges of the crowd, not yet fully aware of the gravity around them. And elders stand still, eyes closed, heads bowed. Some survivors choose to speak on this day, not in long speeches, but in soft sentences. "My brother was taken, we never found him." Or, "My mother died in the fields, she never came home." Others say nothing at all. They simply come and sit and let time pass quietly around them. In schools, children may learn about the regime on this day, not through harsh images, but through stories of resilience and of what it means to survive. At sites like Chong Ek and Tuol Sleng, visitors light candles. Some leave lotus flowers, symbolic of rebirth. Some simply walk in silence, tracing the worn paths between graves, listening to the wind. In this way, May 20th has become more than a national day. It is a collective exhale, a space in the calendar where grief is not hidden, where Cambodia says to itself, "We remember, still, always." And for the younger generations, many of whom were born long after 1979, it is a chance to listen, to ask questions, to understand. Because forgetting, in a place like Cambodia, is never really an option. And remembering does not always mean holding on to hatred. Sometimes it means holding space, for sorrow, for stories, for stillness. From this space of memory, we can now move to what comes after. Not just survival, but revival. Let us now step into the realm of culture. How dance, art, and expression return to Cambodia like green shoots after a fire. And from the quiet rituals of remembrance, a gentle rhythm begins to stir. Not the rhythm of marching feet or shouted slogans, but something far older and far softer. It is the rhythm of silk costumes brushing against wooden floors, of fingertips tracing sacred air, of drums low and patient, beating like the slow return of a heartbeat. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit rehearsal hall. The air is thick with the scent of dust and history. Wooden beams groan softly in the ceiling. And at the centre of the space, a small group of women begin to move. Their hands curl gracefully, their wrists bend in perfect circles, their steps are quiet but precise. This is classical Cambodian dance, an art form nearly lost, now slowly returning to life. Under the Khmer Rouge, almost all forms of cultural expression were extinguished. Painters were executed, musicians silenced, temples defaced, and dancers, especially those trained in the royal courts, were targeted as symbols of elitism in the old world. By 1979, when the regime fell, it was believed that 90% of Cambodia's classical dancers had been killed, but some survived, and among them was a woman named Chia Sami. Chia Sami had once been a dancer at the royal palace. She had trained under the refined discipline of court tradition, a world where movement was language and posture was prayer. After the fall of Pol Pot, she emerged not just as a survivor, but as a custodian of memory. Chia Sami began to teach again, not in grand halls, but in modest rooms, often with broken mirrors and worn floorboards. She gathered the few surviving dancers she could find. Together they pieced the tradition back together, step by step, gesture by gesture, memory by memory. You can imagine the early rehearsals. No music, no costumes, just bare feet on tile floors and voices counting time. It was not simply art, it was reclamation. Every movement repeated was an act of quiet resistance against forgetting. Gradually these efforts were institutionalized. The Royal University of Fine Arts in Phnom Penh reopened its doors. Teachers like Chia Sami passed on their knowledge to a new generation, and the performances, once silent, resumed. Young dancers learned not just technique, but stories. Because Cambodian dance is a form of storytelling, each movement has meaning. A tilt of the head may express longing, a flutter of the hand might speak of loss, and when several dancers move together, it is as if time folds and the old gods walk again. Beyond dance, other cultural forms returned as well. Painters began to sketch once more, not only the horrors of war, but also the softness of rice paddies, the calm of temple gates, the serenity of rural life. Musicians relearned the scales of the Roniat Ek, the traditional xylophone, and the deep vibrations of the score tom drums. Poets began to write again, some in hidden journals, others aloud, their verses gently pushing against the silence that had taken root during the regime. And in all of this, there was a slow awakening, not of grand celebration, but of careful restoration. Culture in Cambodia did not roar back to life. It whispered, it stepped cautiously, it rebuilt itself with reverence, knowing how easily it had been almost erased. Today, these traditions are performed again, not only on grand stages but in village gatherings, at weddings, in classrooms. Young dancers now wear the same ornate costumes their ancestors once wore. Gold-threaded cloth, tall, graceful crowns, the scent of fresh flowers tucked behind the ear. They move through the same choreographies, and in doing so they carry not only beauty but memory. For a people who had nearly lost everything, this return of culture was a kind of healing, a quiet reminder that identity, when nurtured with care, can survive even the darkest of storms. And so now, as the music continues gently in the background, we drift toward our final chapter, toward the legacy that lives not in monuments or museums, but in the people themselves, their minds, their hearts, and the generation still healing. And now, as the music of revival softly fades, we arrive at a place both delicate and profound, the long, quiet journey of healing, a journey that does not end with history books nor with monuments, but that lives on in the everyday moments of life. Imagine yourself walking along a shaded path beneath a canopy of gentle leaves, the dappled sunlight resting quietly on the earth. This path is not unlike the journey Cambodia continues to take, one of slow, patient recovery, where the shadows of the past still linger softly, but where new growth pushes carefully through. The trauma inflicted by the Khmer Rouge was immense. Entire families were shattered, communities uprooted, and the rhythm of daily life violently disrupted. Many survivors carry memories too heavy to voice, and many children and grandchildren bear the silent echoes of those times. This legacy of trauma is complex. It is woven into Cambodia's collective memory and into the personal lives of its people. Yet it is important to understand. Healing does not mean forgetting. It means learning to live with the past while nurturing hope for the future. Across Cambodia today, efforts are quietly taking root to support this healing. Mental health programs, though still limited, are growing. Survivors meet in support groups, sharing stories in soft voices, offering one another understanding where the world once gave only silence. Families rebuild connections, sometimes across generations separated by trauma. Children learn about their history through gentle storytelling, carefully balancing truth with tenderness. Schools incorporate lessons of compassion, emphasizing peace and empathy, to help new generations break cycles of fear. Communities hold ceremonies to honor the past, but also to celebrate survival. Festivals of light and renewal, where laughter can be heard alongside remembrance. And even the arts, those soft, vibrant echoes of culture, continue to offer sanctuary. In poetry, painting, music, and dance, Cambodians find ways to express what words alone cannot. A brushstroke might hold the weight of sorrow, while a dance step can carry the lightness of hope. Imagine yourself witnessing one of these moments, a quiet dance performed at dusk, or a soft song sung beneath the stars. You feel the calm pulse of resilience, a steady heartbeat that bridges past and present. The legacy of trauma is not a chain, but a thread, one that connects the sorrow of yesterday with the strength of today and the promise of tomorrow. As you settle deeper into comfort, let this thought gently ease your mind. Though history is marked by pain, the human spirit can find ways to heal, to remember with kindness, and to carry forward with quiet courage. Now, as our journey through Pol Pot's Cambodia comes to a close, you may feel the weight of what was endured, but also the soft light of what endures. Thank you for joining me on this calm exploration of history. May the stories you've heard settle gently within you, like a soft whisper in the night. If you found this journey meaningful, please take a moment to leave a comment below, share where you are watching from and what time it is there. A like and a subscribe help support this channel and allow more stories like this to be told. Now, allow your mind to rest, your breath to slow, and your body to sink deeper into peace. Good night.